Let's turn now to the successful refutation of Callicles. Now, as I've indicated in some previous videos, this argument is the culmination of the dialogue. It's where they get to the fundamental issue separating Socrates from the three others. And Socrates gives his successful argument against the heart of the position that's motivating these three other people. I'm calling this the coward's pleasures argument for reasons that'll become clear in just a second. Here at the outset, let me emphasize that it can be very easy, especially on a first read, to miss this argument, to miss the import of it, to not see it or not realize that it's the culmination of the dialogue. And there are two reasons for that. One is because it's just like another argument thrown at you. And we've just seen all these other failed attempts at refutation, the jar stories, the life of the Itcher thing, the simultaneity arguments, all these arguments in quick succession. And then he throws this one in there too, right at the end of that list. And so when you're first reading it, it just seems like another argument, but this argument works. And so you can kind of lose the importance of it, or you can kind of just miss it because it's just there alongside these other arguments. Another reason it can be hard to see the importance of this argument is because Callicles actually he acts as though it doesn't really undermine his position. He tries to deflect. He tries to say, "Oh, no, that's not a problem," but it is, and Socrates calls him on it right away. But because of Callicles' reaction, because he's trying to save face in front of the crowd, it can be difficult, right? That can throw off the reader, especially the first time reader. All right, so what is this argument? It is structurally very similar to the life of the Itcher argument, except instead of talking about itchers, we're talking about cowards. That's the basic difference. Otherwise, the argument runs in the exact same way. And so it doesn't even look all that different of an argument. We saw something very similar to it in that life of the Itcher argument. And so that kind of creates a puzzle. If Callicles could just respond so easily to that life of the Itcher argument, why can't he respond so easily to this one? And we'll see in just a second. So, first premise of this coward's pleasures argument. If hedonism is true, well, then the coward lives just as good of a life as the brave person. If you recall the life of the Itcher argument, the first premise was if hedonism is true, then the Itcher lives a good life. And so what we're seeing here is a kind of similar claim, not about the Itcher, but about the coward. And it's a little bit more complicated because it's comparative. It's saying the coward, not just that the coward lives a good life, although that would be implied, but the coward lives just as good a life as the brave person, as a brave person. And what's the idea here? Well, the idea would be something like, well, look, if hedonism is true, to live a good life is simply to experience pleasure. That's what it is to live a good life. It's to do what you want, right? That's what a good life consists in. Cowards do what they want just as much as brave people do. In fact, maybe cowards do what they want more so than brave people. I don't know, right? But at the very least, just as much, right? The brave person wants to charge into battle, and then they do. Fine. The brave person is doing what they want. They experience pleasure. The coward wants to run away from battle, wants to be safe, and so runs away and goes and, hides in a tree or something. And they do that. They're doing what they want. They're both doing what they want. And so, according to hedonism, they both have to be living good lives, equally good lives. They're both equally doing what they want. And so, they both must be living equally good lives. That's the first premise, right? Cowards do what they want just as much as brave people. And so, they both live equally good lives. But that claim there that cowards live just as good lives, just as good of lives as brave people, that's false. Indeed, that's absurd. You can't seriously maintain something like that. Brave people live better lives than cowards, right? It's not true that cowards live just as good a lives as brave people. That's crazy. Brave people live better lives than cowards. And so it logically follows that hedonism is not true. Because if hedonism were true, brave people and cowards would live just as good a lives, but that's not true. Brave people live better lives. And so hedonism must not be true, right? That's the idea. So it works in an exactly analogous way as the itching argument did. If hedonism is true, the itcher lives a good life. That's absurd. The itcher doesn't live a good life. Therefore, hedonism's not true. This one's working exactly the same way, or it has the kind of same logical structure. If hedonism is true, cowards live just as good lives as brave people, but they don't. Brave people live better lives than cowards, so hedonism's not true. Not all pleasures are good. That's the argument. And it raises a lot of questions. And one of the main questions you might have is, well, look, if it's so similar to the itching argument, why doesn't Callicles just respond in the same exact way? Because what I should emphasize, Callicles abandons hedonism because of this argument. It's very clear that he does. Once this argument is done, Callicles says, well, okay, I never really meant to say that all pleasures were good. That is to say, he abandons hedonism. He abandons the claim that all pleasures are good because of this argument. Well, why does he do that, you might think? Why doesn't he just respond in the same way as he responded to the itching argument? And if you recall, with the itching argument, Callicles responded by, quote unquote, biting the bullet. He just said, yeah, fine. The itcher lives a good life. Right? He just, instead of saying that second premise was true, he denied that second premise, right? So why doesn't he just say, no, cowards and brave people live equally good lives? Why can't Callicles maintain that? Why can't he bite the bullet? Well, it's clear why he can't. Because just I don't know how long, 15 minutes earlier or something in their conversation, he was talking about how brave people were the best. He had that whole speech about natural justice, right? And that speech revolved around this idea that there are people who are better and they should have more. And then Socrates and Callicles kind of go back for, who do you mean by these better people? What do you mean? Do you mean like the cow, blah, 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 whatever? And they get clear about it. And Callicles says something. No, I mean like brave people, intelligent, brave people, brave people. And so he just went on at length, Callicles did, about how brave people are the best, how they really live the best lives. They're the best people. And so he can't now say that brave people and cowards are equally as good. They live equally as good lives because of that earlier speech. Socrates has him trapped, and he knows that, right? That's one of the reasons why Socrates pivots to all this stuff about cowardice and bravery. And we're going to see this in more detail in just a second. Or why exactly Socrates went there, how exactly this is working, right? And so Callicles can't bite the bullet here. He can't just say brave people and cowards live just as good lives, because then he would be contradicting himself in his earlier speech. And so Socrates would have him there, right? So Callicles is trapped as far as that goes. Well, okay, fine. But that was, so then you might wonder, well, okay. But you remember, Callicles did he even really mean to bite the bullet with the itching argument? It seemed like his main kind of objection, so to speak, was that it was dealing with these trivial things, right? He complained about that argument. He complained about the simultaneity arguments, right? How they were dealing with trivial things like hunger and so on. So why doesn't Callicles just complain again? Well, it's already clear why he can't. Because this argument doesn't deal with those kinds of trivial examples. It doesn't deal with scratching an itch or eating when you're hungry, right? Callicles' complaint was that I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about justice and brave people and wars and noble things and great, amazing things and virtue and whatever, right? Bravery. Well, look, this argument right here, it doesn't deal with hunger or itching or anything like that. It deals with the stuff that Callicles is talking about. It deals with these exalted things. It deals with these better people, with these brave people, bravery, and so on, right? And so Callicles can't lodge that complaint. He can't lodge the complaint that Socrates, you're always going on at length about trivial matters. I want to talk about important matters. This is an important matter. And so I think this argument is crafted by Socrates with an eye towards that complaint. So it's crafted with an eye towards his Callicles' earlier speech, and with an eye towards the kinds of complaints that Callicles was raising about Socrates' arguments, right? And so those initial attempts at refutation kind of set up this argument, because it's in light of Callicles' dodges to those earlier arguments that Socrates is able to now craft an argument that Callicles can't dodge. He can't bite the bullet. He can't lodge his complaints. He's stuck, right? And so that's why this argument works against Callicles. Socrates has kind of taken away every out. Callicles doesn't have an out. And so Callicles gives in. Now, as I was saying, he tries to save face, right? So Socrates launches the argument. And so look, what's the conclusion of the argument? Hedonism is false. Not all pleasures are good. And in particular, the pleasures of this coward, right? Of a coward. Those are not good pleasures. And if those aren't good pleasures, well, then hedonism is false. There are some pleasures that are not good. Hedonism says all pleasures are good. In response, as I've indicated, Callicles tries to squirm out of it by saying, well, look, oh, Socrates, I never meant to say that in the first place. Only a fool would say something like, all pleasures are good I never meant to say that. That can make you kind of, wait, well, what's going on? So is this not a successful argument? Did Socrates kind of miss the mark? Look at Socrates' next claim. This isn't it verbatim, but no, it doesn't miss the mark. Callicles is trying to save face. Callicles changes his position with that. Callicles did indeed say earlier that all pleasures were good. And in response to this argument, he abandons that position, but tries to make it look like he never meant to say he never meant to claim that hedonism was true in the first place. But Socrates sees what he's doing right away and calls him on it. Yes, you did say that, Callicles, and now you're trying to kind of dissemble. You're trying to, you're being dishonest. Basically, you're not being frank. You're not being open like I thought you would be. And so now Socrates says, I guess I got to kind of deal with what I have. I thought you would be frank and intelligent and open, but you're not. You're going to lie. You don't want to admit. You're too ashamed to admit that you're wrong. You're too embarrassed. Fine. From this point, and so this is the refutation of Callicles. And like I was saying, it can be hard to miss, but Callicles is refuted. His position is refuted. This is the argument against hedonism. This is Socrates and Plato's argument against the idea that living a good life consists in doing what you want. And we're going to see what exactly, how powerful this argument is in just a second, because it still might seem a bit underwhelming. But what I want to note right now is that from this point on in the dialogue, Callicles kind of checks out. He's not actively involved. And so you can read from this point on in the dialogue, Socrates is still kind of talking to Callicles, but Callicles doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He doesn't want to talk anymore. He complains a lot. He just says, yes, fine, Socrates, fine. He doesn't want to be there. He's done. He's done with Socrates. And in fact, at one point, Callicles refuses to respond to Socrates. And so Socrates kind of has to take Callicles' place in the conversation. It's actually just Socrates talking to Socrates. So everything from this point on in the dialogue, whatever Callicles says, is just begrudging. He doesn't actually mean any of it. He just wants to whatever, right? That's how you should read the dialogue from this point forward. Callicles is lost. They've all lost. Now, I've been saying that this argument is kind of the culmination of the dialogue of the whole thing, that this argument is meant to be the successful refutation of this idea that living a good life consists in doing what you want. And you might think, well, so let's return to the argument. You might think, well, I don't know. I mean, it's a bit underwhelming. After all, this ideal, one of the things I've been trying to emphasize is that this ideal, it's not just the ideal of these three ancient Greek guys, Polus, Gorgias, and Callicles, but that this ideal lives today. In fact, this ideal is perhaps even more enshrined in our culture today than it was in ancient Greek culture back in the day. This idea that, living a good life consists in doing what you want. And so this might be something that you, at the very least have confronted. Maybe you think it's true. How could this even be false? That living a good life, how could living a good life consist in anything other than doing what you want? And so, okay, yeah, that seems like a commonsensical, intuitive, true idea, claim, view of the good life, whatever. And then this is supposed to be the argument that undermines it. I mean, I don't know. I don't really care about bravery and cowardice. And I don't know. I mean, fine. Maybe Callicles has these hangups about bravery and cowardice. Like he's all into brave things and yeah, fine. The ancient Greeks more generally were, right? They were always going to war. And when they went to war, they didn't have what do they call it? A kind of professional army in the way that say the United States does, where there are people who enlist and then they are the ones who go off to war or whatever. And then 99.8% of us, or however many it is, just stay here and don't have any immediate contact with war. They didn't have something like that in ancient Greece. All of the citizens would go to war, right? Or not quite all of them, those who could afford it. And it was seen as an honor. The important point is a lot, like just the people would, right? They didn't have a professional army. The army was just the citizens, right? And they were always going to war. And so for in a context like that, something like bravery is going to be a lot more important. It's going to be a lot more important to you whether or not your neighbor is brave, or whether they'll hightail it out of there as soon as the Spartans come over the hill or something, because that puts you in danger. And that puts your city in danger. And so bravery was a lot more central of an ethical ideal for the ancient Greeks than maybe it is for us, right? It's not central to how we think about ethics and morality on a day-to-day basis, because we're not fighting wars nearly so often. We're not, you and I don't go onto the battlefield so often. Most people don't. And so you might think, well, fine, Callicles is refuted, but I don't know. I still think that this idea that living a good life consists in doing what you want, I still think that that's true. I don't have these hangups like Callicles did, or I don't, I'm different than Callicles. I'm not all about these brave people or whatever. Right. And so you might say, look, I'm more than happy to grant that brave people and cowards live just as good lives. Fine. So this argument doesn't do anything for me. That's a little bit too quick, and that misses the real strength and power of this argument, I think, because this argument can generalize. It generalizes to any ethical ideal. Callicles's ethical ideal, his vision of a kind of ethical hero, was someone like Hercules, this warrior, this strong, brave warrior. Right? That was Callicles's ethical ideal. When you say, well, fine, I don't know. I mean, I don't really care about bravery that much. I'm more than willing to admit that brave people and cowards live just good lives. What you're indicating there is that someone like Hercules is not your ethical ideal. Fine. Right? Socrates focuses on bravery and cowardice because that's Callicles's ethical ideal. If Callicles were to have a different ethical ideal, or if a hedonist were to have a different ethical ideal, Socrates could run this same argument with the relevant substitutions. So not focusing on bravery and then the opposite of bravery, cowardice, but focusing on the different ethical ideal and then its opposite. It generalizes. So, for instance, had Callicles instead praised justice, well, Socrates could have run the same argument, just with the appropriate substitutions. And so why does that matter? Well, justice, I think, is a much more common ideal today. So, for example, back in ancient Greece, I already kind of indicated this. They would tell these myths, these stories about Hercules and his great feats, his bravery, his strength, whatever, right? These were stories they would tell kids, right? And you want to be like that. Today, we don't do that. We don't, tell kids stories about Hercules or Achilles or whatever. And yeah, be strong. Go get your spear and take it to your enemy. And yeah, put your spear in their face. And yeah, we don't do that. We tell different kinds of stories to children, say. But these stories carry with them an ethical ideal. So one thing, one kind of story that's, or, one person we hold out as embodying an ethical ideal worthy of imitation, especially to children. One person like that is Martin Luther King Jr., right? And there are children's books written about Martin Luther King Jr. that we read to them. And we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day, where we take kind of time and we, so children get that day off school, but either before or after that day, they'll do activities concerned with his life, learning about him and what he did in his life and so on. We hold him out as an ethical ideal. The Greeks held out somebody like Hercules or Achilles. We today hold out someone like Martin Luther King Jr. This argument that Socrates is advancing could be run against us today with our ethical ideals. We would just need to make the appropriate substitutions. So we could say something like, and so the idea of this Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like he was devoted to justice, not to necessarily bravery or something like that, although he was certainly very brave. But justice was like the main virtue that we see embodied in his life and in his activities. Well, let's just run the same argument then. If hedonism is true, right? And so I'm sorry, I keep interrupting myself. But then the idea is we read these stories about Martin Luther King Jr. We hold him out as an ethical ideal. Why? Because what are we saying when we do that? What are we saying to children? We're saying, live like that. That's a good life. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life was an exemplary life. That's how you want to be. That's the kind of person you want to be. Right? The ancient Greeks would say that about Hercules. Be like Hercules. Be like Achilles. We today don't say that. We say, be like Martin Luther King Jr. That's the kind of life you want to live. That's a good life. Run the same argument then, right? And so making the substitutions, right? So if hedonism is true, well, then the unjust person lives just as good a life as the just person, right? Just people and unjust people live equally good lives. Why? Well, because they both equally do what they want. Just people do what they want. Sure, fine, right? So, just people want to, treat people fairly. And they do that in their life, say. And unjust people, they do what they want. They don't want to treat people fairly. And so they do that. Yeah. I don't know, to equal measure, say, right? There's no reason to think that just people get to do what they want more so than unjust people. So they both equally kind of do what they want. They both equally experience pleasure. And so according to hedonism, at least, they both live equally good lives. But that's crazy, right? If you're actually committed to this ideal that be like Martin Luther King Jr., live like that. Well, that commitment to that ethical ideal implies that no. Just people live better lives than unjust people. Martin Luther King's life was better than the life of his assassin or the life of whatever, a white nationalist or something like that. Because it's devoted to justice and it embodies justice, right? Just people live better lives than unjust people. And so the same conclusion would follow. Hedonism is false. And so what this argument that Plato is highlighting as the culmination of this dialogue, what this argument does is it demonstrates the incompatibility between hedonism on the one hand and then holding any ethical ideal at all on the other. It's put in terms of bravery and cowardice because that's Callicles' ideal. But you could substitute in any ideal you like. And I think that's where the power of this argument comes from. That's the real point of this argument. There's this incompatibility. If you want to say something like justice is important, something like live like Martin Luther King Jr. or whoever, right? Pick your, maybe you don't really like him or whatever. I don't know. Everybody has some sort of ethical ideal. Whatever your ethical ideal is, this argument could be run against you. This argument could be used to show that hedonism is false, right? That's the idea. That's the power of the argument. Hedonism is incompatible with having any kind of ethical ideal. That's why this is the culmination of the Gorgias.